Okay, so I guess that's probably where we should start then, is picking out a wood that is not going to blotch. The best thing that I could recommend, because just about any board has potential to blotch, depending on the way the grain grows. If there's figure, technically figure is kind of the same thing as blotching, except for it's blotching in a very attractive pattern over and over, and that's what we see as like curly maple, for instance, when the grain is actually sort of undulating through the board. So whenever the grain is facing up, you've got an area that's going to soak finish in differently and give it a different color than the rest of the piece. Now, there are certain species that tend to blotch a lot more than others, and the best way to avoid the blotchiness is to avoid the woods that blotch. Unfortunately, though, they're very common woods, so things like birch, maple, cherry, I've got some alder here. A lot of these domestics that we use here in the US are the ones that tend to blotch the most, and that could be problematic. So it's really best to prepare for it, and anytime you've got one of those species in your shop, just assume that it's going to blotch, and then that way you're absolutely covered. And usually the finish just comes out more consistent and clean anyway. So the first thing I want to do is show you the most common thing that most of us are going to do in our shops, and that's grab some good old min wax. This is walnut. I wanted to go with a really dark one so that you could see what happens here. So just the standard oil-based stain, which, by the way, I very rarely use in my work for this exact reason. Okay, so just going to apply it to the alder. And again, this is alder that's had absolutely nothing done to it yet. Just freshly sanded to 180 grit. Okay, not trying to be neat, just trying to get her done. Hey, did you guys happen to see my typo on the announcement for this live Dealy Whacker? Which I didn't realize. I saw people saying, like repeating what I said, but I thought they were just joking until someone said, were you serious when you typed that? Yeah, so for those who haven't seen it, I accidentally, subconsciously, I don't know what was going on in my mind, but I talked about fighting, I was trying to say fighting blotchiness, and instead I typed bitchiness. And it just about spent the whole day saying bitchiness, which was pretty hilarious. But I did change it. Okay, so I'm just wiping off the excess here. Not terrible, but hopefully you could see some of the, it's typically around the areas where the grain changes up pretty significantly, or maybe around an area that's like a knot or something like that. See if, make sure I can get that on camera, get a nice view. Can everybody see that? See? Blotchy. That's blotchy. All right. Again, alder, cherry, birch, maple are all going to have a tendency to do this. Okay, so on the other side, let's divide this piece up into 3 sections, and I'll show you what I like to do to fight blotchiness. All right. Moving right along. Now, there are all kinds of things on the market that you can use for this. Pre-stain conditioners are certainly something that you can use. Those things are fine, but they serve one purpose and one purpose only, is to sort of be a pre-stain. I prefer to use something that's much more applicable to other things in the shop. So for me, shellac is perfect because it's not only a good top coat by itself, but it's perfect for sealing any project, any type of wood. If you, for the rest of your life, every project you ever did, you pre-sealed with like a ½ pound or a 1 pound cut of shellac, your work would be more consistent over time and nothing would ever really, it's like a universal binder. So you can put shellac on everything as a base coat, as a sealer coat, and it will improve the results. So kind of a blanket statement, there may be exceptions, but you get the point. It's better to have a big gallon of shellac than have to get a can of pre-stain conditioner every time you want to do something on a blotchy wood. So I usually get the Bullseye seal coat in a gallon. And I actually did a little math on this during a really big project, a commercial project that a buddy of mine and I were going to do, and I priced out dry flakes versus the price I could get, the lowest price I can get this stuff per gallon. It was actually cheaper to buy this stuff pre-mixed by the gallon than it was to buy the flakes and go through all the trouble of mixing our own. So that's what I recommend doing. Bullseye seal coat. This is what it looks like if you are not familiar. It's good stuff. Now it comes in a 2-pound cut, and I don't even have my eye protection around here, so do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. I'm not real picky about my shellac cuts. Whoops, paper. I know that this is about a 2-pound cut, and I'm going to dilute it roughly 50%. And although I know that's not exactly 1-pound cut, it's close. Close enough for the Spagnola family. Okay, so all I'm going to do now is cut it using the same little measuring device that I stole from the kitchen. Just dilute it down a little bit. You see, 2-pound, and I have an example I'll show you later, 2-pound is a little bit too much. I mean, the thicker this mixture is, and the more concentrated the shellac is, the more it's going to seal off the surface. So maybe I'll talk about the theory behind this. The idea is the surface is going to absorb in different areas. It's going to absorb the finish differently, or the stain differently. And that's what we were talking about before with the grain moving. The idea is the end grain is always going to stain darker than face grain. So if you have wacky stuff, softer parts of the wood, all those things lead to the blotchiness, and the blotchiness is nothing more than an area that's absorbed the stain more. So if we could pre-seal the surface with something that at least partially blocks some of that absorption, you're going to wind up with a much more smooth and consistent surface. But you can go too far. You can put too much shellac on there and completely block off its ability to absorb any stain, which is not good either, especially if you plan on reusing your oil-based stain. So let me just make sure this is nice and mixed here. And yeah, this is just denatured alcohol from Home Depot or Lowe's by the gallon. All right, so what we're going to do here with these 3 different panels, I am going to, maybe I only needed 2 because that's the oil. Basically, the whole thing is going to be sealed with this approximate 1-pound cut of shellac. Actually, you know what? Let's do 1 full strength, 1 with the 1 pound, and then the other with the 1 pound. I'll explain that in a second. That's going to make it sound so much more confusing than it needs to be. The 2 right ones are going to be with the 1 pound. Okay, make sure it soaks in. This stuff dries so fast, but I'll go over it a second time before it's completely dry. If the wood's really, really thirsty, I do add a little bit more as I go, just kind of by eye. Okay, so these 2 panels now have the 1 pound cut each, and I'm going to write it here just in case. I'm going to open up the can again. Okay, and I want to get some of the full strength material now and do a 2 pound on this top area here. Now on my other test board, which I'll show you later, I was able to actually see the difference between the 1 and a 2 pound cut. You may not, just depending on this particular board, it may not look any different. But it might, we'll see. Now normally you want to let this dry for a good hour or 2. Great thing is shellac dries super fast. In this case, we don't really have the luxury of time here, so I'm going to let it dry for just a couple minutes. I'll talk to you guys before we worry about applying any stain to this, and give it some time to cure a little bit, and then we'll jump back into the staining. Okay, I think we can probably jump into the next part here. Now, remember, I have 2 pound cut, 1 pound cut, 1-pound cut. And I'm going to show you two different stains. On the first two panels, the 2 and the 1, I'm going to show you the Minwax oil-based stain that we used before. So what we should see is the 2-pound cut will be sealed better than the 1-pound. Hopefully this is going to be okay. Not letting it completely cure isn't the best thing for a demo, but what are you going to do? Now the other thing to notice is the color should be also lighter. See, because we are sealing the surface. You know, partially, but we're still sealing it, so it's not going to pull in quite as much color as it might otherwise pull in. Now, you can see a pretty good improvement over what we had before. Okay, relatively consistent all the way across. There's a few little dark spots here and there, a little tiny spot there. This one, being the 1-pound cut, should show a little bit more blotching than this one. Either way, you know, whatever variability there is there, maybe the application method I use, they're both sealed pretty good, and the result is pretty good. Certainly better than what we had here, but also notice the dramatic color in, or the dramatic reduction in the intensity of the color. Okay, this is the dark, you know, real deep walnut. I mean, this is labeled dark walnut. This is what it's supposed to look like. This is not what it's supposed to look like. So therein lies the problem, because we wanted this color. Okay, well now we don't have blotching, yay, but we also don't have the color we were after. So this is why I suggest not using standard oil-based stuff. I suggest using a gel stain. Now this is General Finishes Java. I don't have a dark walnut on hand. This is all I have. So this stuff, and not all gel stains are created equal. There are some crappy gel stains out there that I've used before and just had no luck with at all. I have never had a problem with General Finishes stains, and they're stains, they're dyes, and of course they're gel stains. Now the concept with a gel stain is that it doesn't absorb quite as deep. You can see the stuff is thick, it's like pudding. In fact, this looks like pudding. It's going to sit on the surface more. It doesn't rely on real deep absorption to give you the color. So you can actually put it on the surface, you could work it a little bit. If you have an area that's got a little bit of a light streak, you could leave a little bit more material in that spot and just work the surface until it looks exactly the way you want it to. You have that luxury with this stuff. So I will show you. Okay, now normally with a gel stain, I actually thin it out just a little bit, not a lot, just enough so it's a little bit easier to work, because I like to flood the surface with the color and let it set for a few seconds. You can see I got a really, really good color transfer there. The stuff is actually the consistency of loose paint, actually slightly more viscous paint, I should say. But more than anything, pudding. Okay, so I get a clean part of my rag. And now we're going to just wipe off the excess. Now we should really, because it is a 1-pound cut, we shouldn't see a whole lot of difference in the blotchiness. Now see, gel stain, if we had used gel stain from the beginning on this side, we might have actually had less blotching. Gel stain in and of itself, it doesn't absorb as deeply, so you'll get that opportunity to color the surface in a way that hides some of that blotch. So the best combination is a pre-sealed surface and a gel stain. Now, that is about as even and consistent and clean as you can ask a board to be. Sorry, I gotta make sure you guys can see everything. Okay, is that pretty clear? Compared to what we saw on this side. Now, the point here is, obviously, if we can go this dark, we can certainly, if we had the right material, I could certainly hit a dark walnut color, but imagine if I was able to get that level of consistency on a board that normally is going to look like this. okay? This is crap. This is a terrible result. And if you spent weeks working on a project and you get to the point that you stained it, and this is what you end up with, this is actually kind of tricky to recover from, because now that stuff is embedded in the surface and you've got some problems, okay? If you know ahead of time that the wood happens to be a blotch-prone wood, you can prevent this from happening and get a result that looks more like this instead of one that looks like this. Now, I'm curious, just because obviously you wouldn't want to let that dry a little bit more, but I'm curious, if you put the gel stain over top of the oil stain, could you recover without having to strip or sand down the entire project, which would be a blast, I'm sure. Now remember, this side has no shellac at all as a pre-sealer. We're just using the gel stain. And that was the worst part right here. So I'm just curious if we're able to mute some of that discrepancy in color. Need more rag. A little bit, huh? That's better. You can still see it a little bit there, but certainly nothing like what we would have gotten if we had a pre-sealer coat of the shellac on there. Okay, here's another board. This is the one, I've got a thing in Atlanta that I'm going to do this same demonstration at, so I wanted to bring some practice boards with me. This one came out a little bit better this afternoon in displaying the difference. I did the same exact thing that we did here, but you can see, I don't know how well this is going to come across on the webcam, but this is the 2-pound cut, this is the one, and this is again the one with the gel stain. But if you look really close, you can see a lot of extra just black marks and things where the pores were still a little bit more open in the 1-pound cut, and you could see how they were sealed off a little bit better on a 2-pound cut. So the discrepancy here is a little bit more visible. But again, the results are still the same on the final piece, just looks tremendous. Do-do-do-do, boop. And that is what I do. I mean, there are other things you can do. You know, like we talked about, the pre-stain wood conditioner and things like that. Those will work too. But I think you're better off in terms of saving money and having materials that you're going to use for multiple things, not just this particular procedure. Shellac is really the way to go. I mean, shellac is just it's a woodworker's best friend. More people should be using it, faux show. Is this covered in the finishing DVD? No, the finishing DVD is purely on applying varnish, a very simple method for applying varnish for just about any project. You could use this method before the stuff that you would learn on the DVD. Once we apply the stain, after this second step here, when you go to the point of applying your top coat, that's when you would want to employ the method shown in that video. Storage and longevity of products. Well, the seal coat shelf life, I believe, is a year. And that's more than you're probably going to get out of stuff if you pre-mix yourself. Now, I don't know what they do to it that makes it last a year, but I have had cans. This can I got discounted from Lowe's because it had been on the shelf too long, and I haven't touched it for 6 to 8 months, and it's still great. It's still working just fine. So shelf life on that is really, really good. The shelf life for seal coat. Regardless of what the can says, the shelf life for seal coat is when it starts getting chunky and you got a big skin on it. You could probably keep that stuff in the can, sealed up, untouched for years, and it might be okay. If you open it up and you put a little bit on a test board and it cures really nice and hard within 8 hours or so, go ahead and use it. The problem is when you open these things, especially the finishes that dry and cure via oxidation, they get exposed to air, and then that's when the curing process starts. So if it's sealed, they'll last a really long time. As soon as you open them, you're probably not going to get much more than a year out of it, unless you only take a little bit out and put the cap back on, or the lid. You could put your extra finish in mason jars. The bottom line with any finish is to limit the amount of time that it's exposed to air. So when you are pouring some of your polyurethane out of a can, you want to pour it out into a secondary container, only work from your secondary container, seal that thing back up, and limit the amount of time that it's exposed to air, because that will lengthen the amount of time that you have to use it, the shelf life of the product. A lot of people I've heard of using marbles, so that if you don't have another container that's smaller and you take some material out, you need to get rid of some of that air. A couple things you can do. Those spray cans of that heavy air, basically, it's, I forget exactly what the gas is, but an inert gas that you could spray on top pushes the oxygen out and then puts a bed of this gas on top of the finish, put the lid on, and you're good to go. You can also use heavy stuff like marbles. You could put marbles into your bottles and cans to raise the level of the liquid and thereby sort of eliminate any air in the can just because there's no place for it to go. And you just put the cap on that way. I have sprayed polyurethane, and I got to tell you, Brad, I am not a fan. Anytime I've sprayed it, I either get bubbles, it just is messy. And the problem is when you spray anything that doesn't cure or dry or evaporate quickly, it is a very difficult thing to work with. You can get a lot of runs and sags. Really the only way that I have done it in the past, and the only way that I do it is on my final coat. Let's say I'm doing a really big banquet table or a conference table of some sort, and the final coat is critical. You need that to go on as smooth as possible. So a lot of times what I've done in the past is I'll make like a 75% naphtha mixture with just a little bit of poly in it, and I'll spray that on the surface, and that will flash off rather quickly and give me a nice, even, smooth surface without laying down a big, wide sheet of polyurethane, which can lead to the bubbles and things falling in it, and bugs and all kinds of stuff. So that's about the extent of my poly spray. I don't really like it. If I'm going to spray, it's going to be something that's going to dry fast. So lacquers, shellac, water-based materials are all fun to spray. I just don't find oil-based very fun. Brands to avoid. You know what I have in here? Now, this is not meant to be and should not be taken as a blanket statement against their products, but I have some, where is it? Well, quite frankly, I did not enjoy my experience with Olympic gel stain. That's what I have here, traditional mahogany. This stuff is like barn red paint, except for it's not as thick as paint. It's, here, let me put this by the microphone. Okay, it's like liquid. This is like a regular stain. Gel stain should not be that loose. Gel stain should be a gel. So this is poop in a can right here. I do not use shellac on every project. I use it on the ones that I think I might have a finishing problem on. Not every project. And sometimes if I'm just in the mood, if it's, I've got good access to all the parts and it's not a real finicky thing, I'm not inside a cabinet, I don't mind having the smell of alcohol in the shop for a while, I'll do it. Flat panels and stuff. It's really a great initial coat. The bottom line is sealing. When people talk about sealing, the first coat of any finish is a sealer. You don't have to buy anything special to seal the wood. You can just take your normal wiping varnish or polyurethane, dilute it a little bit, and put a very light coat on, let that cure, and then sand the whole surface nice and smooth, and then start laying on your full strength top coats. That works just as well as a sealer as anything else would. So you don't really need to go crazy with different materials, but I just like shellac because it dries really fast, it dries very hard, and within a couple hours I've got that initial coat on there, and then when I start using my more expensive materials for top coats, I don't have to use as much because the wood isn't going to suck it in quite as much as it otherwise would have. So the shellac is kind of like a way of quickly sealing and getting that first coat over with. Now I can worry about building the finish because it's not really going to absorb too deep. So it kind of gets you going a little bit faster. If you're not coloring the wood, then sky's the limit. I mean, if you're not going to put any color on there, you're not going to notice blotching quite as much. There are some woods, though, that if they're that heavily blotch prone, when you put the oil on the surface, an oil-based finish, you're going to really, notice them. But it may not look so bad. Because, I mean, to me, it's kind of weird. One man's blotch is another man's figure, really, if you think about it. So sometimes if you have a blotchy wood that's, maybe it's got a little bit more consistent blotching across the surface, and you just put an oil finish on it, well, that starts to look like texture and depth, and it makes it look like it's got a sort of a 3D element to it. So it might not be such a bad thing. But some people don't like the look of it. So it really just depends on your taste whether or not you have to go this route to prevent blotching. But again, you really can never go wrong with doing this procedure as a precautionary thing.